Hello everyone, I'm Coach Tickety, and today we're going to be talking about how to counter enemy supports in your games in Overwatch 2. Now, you probably don't often think about how to counter enemy supports in particular because you're usually thinking about dealing with tanks and DPS first, but when it comes down to it, in the right hands, supports can carry games just as well as any other role, and it's very important to know how to play around all these very distinct heroes. So today we're going to be breaking down all the supports in Overwatch 2, including the newest one, Lifeweaver, talking about their playstyles, things they like to do in a game, and then talking about counter picks for each of the different roles, tank, DPS, and support that you might want to try out to help them find less value on the enemy team. If you guys like this type of content, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know down in the comments who's your go-to support main this season. Who are you ranking up with in Season 4? And if you're looking to rank up this season, you're looking for more ways to improve your play, you should check out GameLeap.com. On the site, you will find hundreds of guides made by top-level coaches that will cover everything you could possibly want to know about Overwatch 2, whether those are in-depth guides about a specific topic or step-by-step hero courses designed for players like you in mind. So do yourself a favor and click the link below this video or just head over to GameLeap.com and get your membership started today. Alright, let's jump right into our supports, starting with Ana. Ana is all about her range and the power of her cooldown, so you'll want to make sure you're able to shut down both of those things in your games against her, which means you'll either need to put up defensive barriers in the front line or close the distance safely on her by approaching her on the flank. For tanks, I would recommend Winston. It is a bit of a skill matchup when you're jumping Ana directly. You need to make sure you're able to block both her sleep and her nade if you want to find real value there, but even if you're not jumping on Ana directly, using the bubble to block her line of sight can help isolate any targets that are closer to the front line for your team. When you are diving Ana and trying to kill her, you need to make sure that you're playing safe enough to outplay her cooldowns just in case she keeps herself healthy with the nade or ends up denying your aggression with the sleep dart. You don't want to get caught sleeping when the enemy starts surrounding you. For DPS, I'll recommend Hanzo because you'll usually be able to get some good shots on her if she's scoped in at range and if she stops paying attention to you, and if not, you'll be able to put out a good amount of pressure onto the rest of her team with your close range damage and storm arrows to force her to use nades defensively on her team instead of aggressively onto your team. Additionally, your Dragon Strike might not find the most damage every time, but it can be a great tool for splitting the enemy team if the Ana is playing too far away. Even if she's not taking direct damage, it'll force her to play further away from her team, which can lead her to being more isolated and getting less healing during the fight. And for supports, I'll recommend Kiriko here. Pretty straightforward matchup. You've got good damage, which you can threaten both at range or up close when you hit the flank, and your Suzu is a great counter to any anti-healing or sleep effects that Ana puts out. Next up is Baptiste, who is an AoE healing machine. He puts out a ton of base level healing from his secondary fire, and then he's got two very strong defensive cooldowns in his regen burst and his immortality field. On top of that, he's also got pretty strong damage output, but what he's missing is decent mobility and the ability to split his focus very effectively, since he does need to focus on getting direct hits with his secondary fire to get the maximum healing. So when going up against a Baptiste, I'd recommend approaching him from multiple angles to try and split his attention and the rest of his team so that he has to pick and choose where he puts his focus. In the tank line, no one does this better than Wrecking Ball, who can not only approach from pretty much any angle he chooses to, but can also displace the enemy team and force them into split positions. Whenever Baptiste looks for immortality field or amplification matrix value, it's usually pretty easy for Wrecking Ball to deny that by either rolling through or going for a hard engage around a pile driver or sometimes even his mines. For our DPS picks, Sojourn loves it when the enemy team groups up around a Baptiste because she'll be able to find easy railgun charge and find a ton of value from her disruptor shot. Again, timing these around immortality field or amplification matrix is almost guaranteed value. For the support line, we're going to pick up Ana because the stronger range of her rifle allows her to get more precise healing off on her teammates as well as potentially duel the Baptiste from far away. And of course, the anti-healing effects of her grenade will completely shut down 90% of Baptiste's kit and will almost always force him to use an immortality field if your team is following up on those opportunities. Next up is Brigitta, and while she does offer pretty strong AoE healing, she is locked down by her range and lack of mobility. To deny value from an enemy Brigitta, you don't want to brawl around her up close for too long, and instead you want to try and poke her out whenever you can to force her to play more defensive positions and whenever possible break her shield. For tanks, I'd recommend Orisa because even if the enemy front line is brawling you, you usually have enough cooldowns to survive any opportunities. And since Brig is relatively squishy, if she finds herself up close against an Orisa, you can usually find the kill. Additionally, if you notice a Brig team grouping up to get benefits from her rally overhealth, you can try to counter that by keeping them grouped and doing a bunch of damage with your Terra Surge. For DPS, we can try Mei to safely threaten the enemy front line and use our wall to either split the tank away from Brig's healing or to catch the Brig out herself if she's playing too close. And once again, Mei's ultimate Blizzard is great against a grouped up team, so anytime they're grouped up trying to benefit from Brig's healing or get the overhealth from rally, you can usually freeze a target or two. And for supports, I'll recommend Baptiste here because he's got stronger AoE healing and more precision damage, which can allow your team to come out on top even during a brawl, which we're usually trying to avoid against a Brig. Use your immortality on anyone getting all in, and use your amp matrix to punch through the enemy frontline aggressively if you notice the Brig standing too close. Next up is Kiriko, and she's a very hard character to counter directly because of the strength of her cooldowns. So instead, what we're going to try to do is try to force out her cooldowns as often as possible to make her more vulnerable, as well as take away a lot of her utility away from the team. For the tank line, Winston's a pretty easy pick to just jump on the Kiriko anytime you get the chance and force her cooldowns that way. If you happen to notice the Kiriko's alone when you're jumping on top of her, try to save your bubble, because she's likely just going to teleport away anyway, and you'll be denying yourself a very strong cooldown. But if you can save the bubble, you'll be able to go in aggressively even sooner and probably punish the Kiriko before she's got her cooldowns back. You can usually skip that step if you have Primal Rage available, since you'll be able to keep up with the Kiriko no matter where she goes. For DPS, I'd recommend Echo into Kiriko, because it's going to be very hard for her to hit you, let alone hit your head when you're flying above her, and you can use your poke and your sticky bombs to try and force out any of her defensive cooldowns. And since Kiriko has relatively low healing output and it's mainly single target, your poke damage will be finding a ton of value, and it can be very hard for her to stabilize targets that you've dropped below 50% HP and you're trying to finish off with your focusing beam. And for supports, we'll recommend Zenyatta into Kiriko just for the ability to put out much more consistent damage, not only in the form of actual damage, but also from the damage amp from your Discord orb. This will usually force the enemy Kiriko to focus mainly on healing instead of damage, which can in turn allow your entire team to play more aggressively as a whole. Next up is Lifeweaver, who just got some very nice buffs to both his control scheme and his healing numbers, so he's much more viable to play. But his biggest weakness still is his personal survivability. He's very squishy and he's got a very big hitbox, which can make him very susceptible to dive attempts. So in the tank line, I'll recommend Doomfist for as much all-in potential as possible. You'll want to threaten him often whenever he's in range, and you'll usually have easy follow-up against his gigantic hitbox. And even against enemies that get life gripped away, you can usually chase those down and finish the kill as Doomfist with your multiple mobility cooldowns. For DPS, Tracer's an easy pick into Lifeweaver because she can get aggressive on him pretty much 24/7. And because Lifeweaver's damage is pretty lackluster and he doesn't have much self-healing, it's pretty easy for Tracer to win that duel every time. One thing to keep in mind in this matchup, however, is that Life Grip will save any targets who are stuck by a pulse bomb. They cannot take damage while they're being pulled away, so maybe save those bombs for Lifeweaver himself. And for supports, again, with the interest of going all in 24/7, we're going to pick up Lucio for that speed boost. You'll want to get aggressive against Lifeweaver before they can even get any Life Grip value to deny any aggressive attempts from his teammates. And as Lucio, there's also plenty of potential for booping people off of high grounds if they're using the pedal platform to reposition. And next up is Lucio himself, who is all about that speed boost, so you're going to have to be ready for any speed engages from him and his teammates. You can do this by saving important cooldowns, playing split away from your front line, or just by having high grounds under control. For the tank line, I'd recommend Ramatra, who can survive a lot of front-loaded aggression with strong use of his cooldowns, and can even slow any approaching enemies with his Ravenous Vortex. This can even pull Lucio off of any walls that he's riding on. It will be a bit hard to find annihilation value in this matchup though, since they can likely just speed away or get countered by sound barrier. Overall, this matchup between Ramatra and Lucio will usually come down to not wanting to go first because the other team will have cooldowns that can shut down your aggression. For DPS, I'll recommend Cassidy, who can safely stay at range and avoid any rush attempts while still getting good poke damage out. And since it can be very hard to actually focus down an enemy Lucio while they're skating all over the place, your magnetic grenade can definitely help you finish the kill when your shots can't. And in the support line, we'll pick up Baptiste for his ability to peel and survive those aggressive all-in attempts with really strong AoE healing, and of course his immortality field. And individually, you'll want to use your exo boots to keep yourself on high grounds as often as possible to avoid being caught in those rush attempts. Next up is Mercy, and Mercy's not really a hero you can realistically counter in a lot of situations. You'll want to try and focus her whenever possible, but mainly you're going to have to be aware of the value that her pocket target is finding more than the Mercy herself. But do keep in mind that the Mercy herself will usually become a lot more vulnerable later on after her DPS or her tank starts backing up. For tanks, I'd recommend Roadhog, who's one of the few tanks that can catch Mercy even out of the air or interrupt her res attempts with his hook, and it's usually pretty safe for a Roadhog to approach even a pocketed enemy DPS thanks to his high health pool and his self-healing. Just make sure you're able to get around that enemy tank because that pocketed DPS will be finding a ton of value if you waste too much time. For DPS, Soldier 76 puts out a very consistent amount of pressure and can self-heal and change his position readily to help him survive against pocketed DPS in duels. And sometimes some clever repositioning can even allow your Soldier player to find angles against the enemy Mercy and force her out of the fight. And if you catch the enemy Mercy flying around in open space, a well-timed tack visor can almost always find the kill. And for supports, I'll recommend Zenyatta here because he puts out a very similar damage amplification in the form of Discord Orb, but he's also a lot more independently valuable because he's putting out damage himself. He also has a much stronger defensive ultimate in Transcendence, which allows you and your team to focus more on winning the front line with more damage output, as well as a stronger teamfighting ultimate. Next up is Moira, who can be very hard to punish individually because of her fade, but she is limited by her range. Against her, you'll want to take multiple angles around the enemy team and force the Moira to pick and choose where she puts her healing. For tanks, I'd recommend D.Va for her ability to move around very easily and threaten all those very unique angles, as well as use her defense matrix to eat up every single orb that Moira throws your way. You probably won't often be killing Moira yourself as D.Va, but you will make playing against her much easier for your team. For DPS, I'd recommend Sombra because you can very easily set up behind the enemy team thanks to your stealth, which allows a lot of easy off-angle opportunities. And it's no secret that a lot of DPS will have trouble dealing with an enemy Moira in the duel because of her self-healing and her auto-aim weapon. But as Sombra, the extra damage that you can get by hacking the Moira can give you the leg up in this duel. Additionally, your hack or your EMP will cancel Coalescence, but do keep in mind that Moira's fade can now be used during her ultimate as of this season, so you need to be able to play around that as well. And for supports, I'll recommend Ana, who should be able to very easily outrange the enemy Moira and her team, as well as use her huge utility in the form of her anti-healing and sleep darts to outpace the enemy Moira's team. Just keep in mind there are some DPS Moira players who will try and force the 1v1 against you as Ana, so make sure you save a cooldown to keep yourself alive or just play near some more teammates. Next up is Zenyatta, who puts out a ton of damage but is very susceptible to aggression. You want to make sure you're avoiding open and long sightlines and to be able to dive him as often as possible to deny that strong damage output. For the tank line, I'll recommend Junker Queen, and while it might be difficult to get on top of the Zen directly as the Queen, the amount of damage you'll be doing to the rest of his team can be very tough for Zen's healing to keep up with. And of course, Rampage will apply the anti-healing, which denies a lot of value from Zen's Transcendence as long as you're hitting more than just the Zen himself. On DPS, you can pick pretty much any dive hero and have a good game against a Zenyatta, but here in this video, I'm going to recommend Reaper specifically because he's got a very easy kill on Zen as long as you can get close enough, and your TP plays should allow you to do that just fine. Unlike some other dive DPS, if you are getting forced out a lot as Reaper and you can't find the Zen directly, again, you can just put a ton of damage onto the rest of his team that the Zen will have trouble healing through. And even if he does have Transcendence, Death Blossom acts so fast that it'll usually find a kill or two before the trans healing can come in, as long as the Zen isn't preemptively reacting. And on supports, we're going to pick up Ana, of course for the anti-healing effects to counter Transcendence, no duh, but also because you'll be putting out a ton more single target healing than the enemy Zenyatta, which can help your team outpace the enemy team's damage and win in the front line. Just make sure you're watching out for Zen's damage, and particularly as Ana, don't stand still scoped in for too long or you might just eat one of Zen's volleys. Supports are not often thought of as the go-to pop-off playmakers of a map or the really defining heroes of any given composition in Overwatch 2. But in the right hands and in the right situations, they can absolutely take over a lobby, and they can be very difficult to deal with if you haven't thought about countering them. I hope the advice in this video helps you analyze your enemy supports a little bit more and maybe gives you some solutions if they start posing more problems in your games. Anyway, that's all for me today, everyone. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you in the next one.